September 20th, 1926. Cicero, Illinois. A quiet afternoon outside the Hawthorne Hotel, the unofficial headquarters of Al Capone's growing empire, was about to become the most violent 60 seconds of his life. Capone was 27 years old, already the most powerful bootlegger in Chicago, already a man other gangsters feared and respected in roughly equal measure. He'd survived gang wars, betrayals, the ordinary violence of his profession. He believed, in a particular way, that powerful young men believe things about their own invulnerability, that he had a handle on the dangers of his world, that he understood the rules well enough to anticipate the threats. He was wrong, and the North Side gang was about to prove it to him in the most direct way possible. The conflict had been building for over a year. Capone's organization controlled the South Side and the western suburbs, including Cicero, where the Hawthorne Hotel served as both a luxury headquarters and a symbol of his growing dominance. The North Side gang, led by Hemi Weiss after the earlier near-fatal shooting of their previous leader, controlled territory on Chicago's North Side. Between them lay an uneasy, frequently violated truce that both sides understood would eventually collapse into open war. Weiss had personal reasons to hate Capone beyond simple business rivalry. Capone's organization had been implicated in the killing of Weiss's close associate, Dion O'Banion. 2 years earlier, a murder that had transformed business competition into blood feud. Weiss wanted Capone dead, not as a strategic business decision, but as a matter of vengeance that had calcified into obsession. By September 1926, Weiss had decided to end the conflict decisively. He planned an assault that would be remembered, even by the violent standards of Prohibition-era Chicago, as one of the most audacious attacks ever attempted against a single target. Capone had lunch that day at Hawthorne Inn restaurant, across the street from the hotel that served as his headquarters. It was an ordinary Monday. Paperwork, business meetings, the routine administration of an illegal empire that had grown large enough to require genuine logistical sophistication. He sat at his usual table near the window, eating with several of his lieutenants, including his bodyguard Frankie Rio, a man whose instincts would matter more in the next few minutes than perhaps any other factor. Outside, the street looked ordinary. Cars passed. Pedestrians went about their afternoon business. Nothing about the scene suggested that 8 automobiles were converging on the location with the specific purpose of killing everyone inside. The first vehicle appeared at 1:15 p.m., slowing as it passed the restaurant. The driver fired several rounds from a pistol through the window before accelerating away. Not the main assault, but a calculated diversion designed to draw Capone's security to the front of the building, away from where the real attack would unfold. It worked exactly as intended. Frankie Rio, however, had survived enough violence to develop instincts that overrode the obvious red of the situation. As Capone's bodyguards moved toward the apparent threat at the front entrance, Rio grabbed Capone by the arm. "Boss, get down. This isn't right." "What do you mean? They already came and went. That wasn't the attack. That was bait." Rio's voice carried the particular intensity of someone whose survival instincts had just overridden every social convention about how you spoke to your employer. "Get on the floor, now." Capone, to his credit, didn't argue with the tone of absolute certainty in Rio's voice. He dropped. Seconds later, the real assault began. A convoy of cars, eyewitness accounts varied between 7 and 10 vehicles, rolled slowly past the Hawthorne Hotel and the adjacent restaurant. Inside them were approximately 20 to 30 men, armed with an arsenal that included Thompson submachine guns, shotguns, and rifles. This was not a drive-by shooting in the ordinary sense. This was a mobile military assault organized with a level of planning and resources that exceeded almost anything previously seen in American organized crime, more closely resembling a coordinated military operation than a typical gangland hit. The cars opened fire simultaneously, raking the hotel and restaurant facades with what witnesses estimated as over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The sound was, according to multiple accounts, like nothing Chicago had heard before. Not the isolated gunfire of typical gang violence, but a sustained, mechanical roar that seemed to last far longer than the actual duration of the attack, the kind of noise that registered in the body before the mind could process what was producing it. Windows shattered across both buildings in a cascading sequence, glass raining down onto the sidewalk in sheets that caught the afternoon light before scattering across the pavement. Brick facades were pockmarked and gouged, chunks of masonry exploding outward where rounds found their mark against the building's exterior. A woman pushing a baby carriage nearby threw herself and the child to the ground, narrowly avoiding the gunfire that tore through the space where they'd been standing seconds earlier, her scream lost in the overwhelming noise of the assault. Inside the restaurant, Capone lay flat against the floor, his face pressed against tile that had been cleaned that morning and was now collecting dust and debris from the ceiling plaster being shaken loose by the impact of bullets against the building's exterior. The floor vibrated beneath him with each volley, a physical sensation that transmitted the violence directly into his body even as he couldn't see what was happening outside. He had been shot at before. He had witnessed violence, ordered violence, lived inside violence as an unremarkable feature of his professional life since he was a teenager. But there was something fundamentally different about lying on a restaurant floor while a sustained mechanical barrage tore through the space above him, something that stripped away every layer of the careful invulnerability he constructed around himself over a decade of building his reputation. This wasn't a single bullet, a single moment of danger that passed quickly. This was sustained, relentless, seemingly endless, long enough that his mind had time to fully register what was happening, long enough that the fear had room to develop into something more complete than the quick adrenaline spike of ordinary danger. Frankie Rio lay beside him, covering Capone's body with his own as much as a cramped space between tables allowed, continuing to issue instructions in the controlled voice of a man managing crisis through sheer professional discipline honed by years of exactly this kind of work. Stay down. Don't move. They're not stopping for a while. How long? However long it takes. Stay down. Capone, public enemy in waiting, the man whose name would eventually become synonymous with fearlessness and dominance, found himself doing exactly what he was told. His body responding to instinct rather than calculation for perhaps the first time in years. Every part of his training, his pride, his carefully cultivated identity as someone who commanded rather than obeyed, was overridden by the simple animal recognition that survival required absolute stillness and absolute trust in the man beside him. The attack lasted, by various estimates, somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes, an eternity when measured in the actual experience of lying on the floor while mechanized gunfire destroys the building around you, a relative blink when measured against the scale of devastation the North Side Gang had clearly intended. When the convoy finally moved on, the attackers apparently satisfied they'd done sufficient damage, or perhaps simply running low on the staggering quantity of ammunition they'd expended. The silence that followed was almost as disorienting as the noise had been. Capone lay still for several seconds after the gunfire stopped, his body not yet receiving the message from his brain that the immediate danger had passed. Around him, glass crunched under the movement of people beginning, cautiously, to rise from where they'd taken cover. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting orders, organizing a response, doing the practical work that violence always requires in its immediate aftermath. Rio helped him up. Capone's legs, where he tried to stand, did not entirely cooperate. There was a fine tremor running through his hands that he hadn't given himself permission to feel until that moment, hadn't allowed himself to register, while the immediate crisis demanded total focus, the actual physical experience of having nearly died. "You're all right," Rio said, though it was as much question as statement. "I'm all right," Capone repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, uncertain even as he said them. The damage to the building was extraordinary. Later assessment would count over 1,000 bullet holes across the hotel and restaurant facades. Remarkably, a fact that would be discussed in Chicago for years afterward as either miraculous luck or evidence of poor marksmanship despite the overwhelming firepower deployed. No one had been killed in the attack. Several people had been wounded, including a woman who'd been struck by glass fragments, but the catastrophic casualty count that the sheer volume of gunfire might have suggested simply hadn't materialized. Capone surveyed the wreckage of his own headquarters, windows gone, walls perforated, the physical evidence of an assault specifically designed to kill him, and felt something that he would later struggle to name precisely, something that sat uncomfortably alongside the relief of having survived. Fear, not the abstract, professional awareness of danger that he carried throughout his criminal career, the kind of fear that informed strategic decisions without ever quite touching the personal core of his identity. This was different. This was visceral, physical, undeniable. The fear of a body that had nearly stopped existing, communicating to a mind that had been too busy surviving to process the experience while it was happening. He went home to May that night. Their house in Chicago Heights felt different when he arrived. Not changed in any physical way, but altered by his own perception. Every ordinary domestic detail, suddenly precious in a way it hadn't been that morning. May had heard about the attack before he arrived. Chicago's gossip networks moved faster than official communication, and by evening, exaggerated account of the assault had already spread through the city. She'd been waiting. The particular kind of waiting that the wife of a man in Capone's profession had learned to do. Controlled, outwardly composed, internally consumed by a fear she'd trained herself not to show. When Capone walked through the door, she didn't ask questions immediately. She simply looked at him, checking, with the thoroughness of someone who needed visual confirmation before she could fully believe what she'd been told, that he was actually unharmed. "I'm fine," he said, anticipating the question. "I know you're fine. I can see that." Her voice carried an edge that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it. The particular frustration of someone who's been frightened and is now channeling that fear into something that resembles irritation, because irritation is easier to express than terror. "I heard there were 1,000 bullets. That's probably an exaggeration." "Was it?" Capone was quiet for a moment. "No," he admitted, "probably not." May crossed the room and put her arms around him, not gently, not the careful affection of ordinary domestic life, but with a kind of fierce intensity that conveyed everything she hadn't said yet, everything she'd been holding while she waited for a confirmation that he was alive. Capone held her back and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, unable to maintain the careful emotional control that had defined his public self since he was a teenager fighting in Brooklyn streets. "I wasn't afraid of dying," he said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that he would never have permitted in front of his men, that existed only in this room, with this woman, in particular safety that marriage sometimes provides for admissions that would be dangerous anywhere else. "Lying there on that floor, with the bullets coming through, I wasn't thinking about dying. What were you thinking about?" "You. Sonny, I was thinking that if I died, you'd be alone with him, and he wouldn't have a father, and you'd have to explain to him someday what happened to me, and I wouldn't be there to help either of you through it." He pulled back slightly, looking at her directly. "I'm not afraid of dying, May. I've never been afraid of that. But I am afraid of leaving you. Both of you. That's the thing I couldn't stop thinking about." It was, by Capone's own later admission to the few people he trusted enough to discuss it with, the first time he had said something like that out loud. The first time he'd articulated, even to himself in fully formed language, that the fear he carried wasn't really about his own mortality. It was about the people who depended on him, the people whose lives would be irreversibly altered by his death, the responsibility that had quietly become more central to his identity than the power and violence that defined his public reputation. The Hawthorne Hotel assault became known, in Chicago crime history, as one of the most spectacular failed assassination attempts ever recorded, remarkable not for what it accomplished, but for what it revealed about the scale of violence that organized crime in Prohibition-era America had reached. The North Side Gang's audacity in mounting such an overwhelming attack in broad daylight, in a public commercial district, represented an escalation that shocked even hardened observers of Chicago's underworld. For Capone personally, the attack marked a turning point that was more psychological than strategic. He increased the security, certainly, the practical response that any rational person in the position would have implemented. But the deeper change was less visible, harder to document in the historical record, evident mainly in fragments of testimony from people who knew him well enough to notice the difference. He became, in the years following the Hawthorne attack, somewhat more careful about exposing himself to unnecessary risk. Not from cowardice, but from a kind of calculation that hadn't existed before, an awareness that his death would have consequences beyond the abstract disruption to his business operations. He thought, more explicitly than he previously had, about Sonny growing up without a father, about May managing alone, about the particular cruelty of leaving people who depended on him to face a world that he wouldn't be there to help them navigate. This awareness didn't transform him into a cautious man. Exactly. He remained, for the rest of his violent career, someone who accepted danger as the unavoidable cost of his chosen profession. But something had shifted in how he held that danger, a recognition, forged in those 60 seconds on a restaurant floor while bullets tore through the building around him, that his fearlessness had always been, at least partially, a performance, that underneath the legend of Al Capone, untouchable and invincible, there was a man who loved his wife and his son enough to be genuinely afraid of leaving them. He never spoke publicly about that fear. The newspapers covered the Hawthorne attack as a story about violence and gang warfare, about the escalating conflict between rival criminal organizations, about the remarkable fact that no one had died despite the staggering volume of gunfire. They never knew about the conversation in his living room that night, about the admission he made to his wife at a moment when the careful architecture of his public invincibility had, for once, come down. But May knew, and in knowing, she understood something about her husband that the world never quite grasped, that the man other people feared, the legend that newspapers built and rivals tried to kill, was also, underneath everything, simply someone afraid of leaving the people he loved. That fear, more than any gun or any empire, was perhaps the truest thing about him.